is a neat day. It's not the most important day of the Christian year. The most important day is the day after Easter, when we decide what we're going to do with the good news. Last week we talked about the beginning of this series that we're going to do through Pentecost that has to do with evangelism. That the reason the Monday after Easter is so important is that we've been given this wonderful gospel of a resurrected Christ who loves us and who would save us, and we've been given that gospel to share. Now, as I noted last week, there are a number of reasons why we sometimes don't fulfill that commission of God to share the good news. Sometimes it's because we think it's not our job. That's somebody else's task to share the good news. That's why we hire evangelists and preachers and other people. Sometimes I suspect we don't share the good news because we're not really sure either A, what we believe or how to put it into words. And so we kind of feel like maybe we just don't have the skills, the gifts, the graces to share, and so we don't. Today I want to start on what is going to become over the next 4 weeks, 4 different arenas in life that I think provide fertile ground for sharing the good news. And I do this because I really believe that if we can identify times and places in our lives when the good news might be shared, then it becomes much easier to do it. Because what we're doing is looking at life generally and saying, is this a time when I can tell people just how much God really loves them? As I mentioned to the kids, this is Earth Day. We've got some banners on the wall in the front of the bulletin. And one of the things that I became intrigued with in terms of Earth Day as we read things about them is that generally Earth Day, at least as it is celebrated, is a day when we talk about creation and how we might take responsibility to save it, to empower it, to protect it from all of the ravages that we as people kind of put in the middle of this earth that we live on. Let me suggest, though, that for those of us who are Christians, while that is important, there is another advantage to Earth Day. And that is that as we celebrate Earth Day and as we look at this marvelous planet that God has given us, if we really think about it, we become aware that it is an amazing gift from God. That everything we have and everything we need to survive from the moment we draw our first breath in this world until we draw our first breath in the kingdom to come is here. That God did not leave out one single solitary thing that you and I needed in order to survive. We have oxygen to breathe. We have water that keeps us hydrated. We have food that fuels the engines of our bodies so that we have the energy to do what we need to do. He's given us marvelous minds that we could use to create things to help us in this life, to make our lives and the lives of others easier. He's given us amazing insight into ways that we can work together to protect and to heal these bodies of ours with His help when we become ill. This earth we live on and what it contains is an absolutely amazing thing. What would happen on this day if every time we went to people and said, it's Earth Day and I want to talk to you about protecting the earth, we spend an equal amount of time saying it's Earth Day and I want to share with you the good news of a creator God who gave us this wonderful thing and all of the blessings that go with it? What would happen if we used Earth Day not just as a time to talk about protecting the earth, but equally as a time to focus on celebrating our God and His love made manifest in this world that we live in? See, I really think that one of the things that might help us share the good news of Jesus Christ with the world that needs to hear it is if we came to understand that every celebration of life is an opportunity Not just to celebrate and have fun, but to share the good news of Jesus with the world. A few minutes ago, we celebrated the sacrament of holy baptism. I hope that you were invested in the liturgy, the work of the people that goes along with that. Because if you listen to everything that was said from the time Sean and Hannah and their family got to the front of the church until they sat down, it was a celebration of the God of love. It was not just a celebration of the baptism of Greta, but it was a celebration of all that God has done. As He created the earth, as He separated the waters, as He nurtured Jesus in the water of the womb, as He instituted baptism, as He saves us. And I suspect that that's true of every celebration of life. That within the celebration, if we're serious and if we look closely enough, we find a time and a place to say to those around us, guess what? God really loves you. Guess what? God sent His Son, and because of that gift, you don't have to worry about death because He conquered that. Guess what? Amidst all of the brokenness and all of the pain of life, you have a God who, in His saving act of Jesus Christ, chooses to be with you and hold you always with His love and with His grace. Last week, I had the opportunity for 2 days to participate in a post-Easter retreat sponsored by our Board of Discipleship on the conference level. Got to do something I probably hadn't done for 30 years. We started a campfire up at Chippewa on Monday night, and after the sun went down and it got real dark, those of us who were gathered around the campfire. And I heard something absolutely amazing that I had never thought of before. In the celebration of that moment, one of the people at the campfire, it wasn't me because I'm not this smart, took that celebratory moment and used it to proclaim the gospel. We're sitting there looking at this wonderful bed of coals and this fire, and quite frankly, I built the fire. And I was congratulating myself on how wonderful it was, because it really was. It's one of the best fires I ever built. And the guy looked at me and he said, you know, the amazing thing about that fire is that it's made out of wood. And the wood came from trees. And those trees grew because God gave us a creation. And those trees grew because part of what they do is they suck in light. The light and the chlorophyll, and they help it to be green, and they nourish it, and it grows. And what is there in that fire pit is there because God created a world where trees suck in light. And those trees died. And we cut them up, and we burn them. And they give the light back to the world in the midst of the darkness. Man, I never thought of that before. You see, what he did was he used the celebration of the campfire to talk about a God who gives and gives and gives, and even when we think something isn't useful anymore, uses it to spread the light into a dark, dark world. Well, eventually I pulled out the telescope. We got looking at stars, and everybody else got tired, and I put the telescope up, and I went back to the fire just to sit by myself for a little bit. And a friend came up and sat down next to me, the one that had talked about the trees that take in light and give it off. And he said, you know, one of the great celebrations of life is that, like the tree who takes in light and gives it off, we as God's people take in the love and the grace of God in our lives. And God has so created us that we can then give it off and share it in the lives of others. He said the amazing thing was that tree that we burnt in that fire pit that night could have just stayed out in the brush and eventually deteriorated, and it would have created some good soil, I guess. But he said, on this night, God knew what you and I needed was light in a dark world. And what God knows is that there are literally millions of people in the world who need to hear the good news of a God who loves them and who is with them and who holds them and who saves them. And we, like the tree, have absorbed that good news. And he said, now it's time for us to share it with the world. Last Sunday when I was here preaching, most of my family was in Alexandria, Virginia at the wedding of a nephew. I didn't want to go because I'm too cheap to buy a tux, and they said they wouldn't let me in if I didn't have one on. The day after the wedding was the real celebration because I have two little brothers whose birthdays are a day apart. And I guess from what I hear about the celebration at the birthday party on Sunday, it got a little out of control, which doesn't surprise me very much knowing my family. But as I visited with my folks on Thursday when I picked them up from the airport, and they were telling me about this marvelous celebration they had with about 25 family members there, I found myself reflecting back on the campfire and the call to share the good news of Jesus Christ amidst the celebrations of life. And I asked myself, I just wonder, if I would have had the courage at that celebration to say something about the love of God that infuses our lives. If I hadn't, I suspect I would have missed an amazing opportunity. Not that my family needs to hear it, but they kept interacting with people on the golf course, and some of them may have needed that rather than to have their ball marked with the utility flag. One of the places, one of the times that you and I are called to share the good news is amidst the celebration. And when it gets difficult to remember that we are called to be the sharers of the good news, the evangelists of the world, when we forget that it is our task to share the light in a dark world. Maybe in my life, maybe in your life, it will be helpful to walk into each day saying, on this day, there will be a moment of celebration. And I want God's Spirit to remind me in that moment of celebration that it is an opportunity to share the love of God. We don't have to do that in a heavy-handed way. We don't have to try to force people to believe. But in that moment of celebration, it becomes an opportunity to say, look what God has done for us. Just like on this earth day, as we worry about saving the world, maybe it's also an opportunity to look at this dirt that we live on and say, look what God has done for us. That's sharing the good news. That's being faithful people of God in the midst of the world. Amen.